Welcome to the PhD webinar on clarity. This is part one of a two-part webinar series looking at clarity, where in this webinar the focus is predominantly going to be on the principle of character-action relationships. Now, this is also part of an ongoing webinar series, which is connected to the Cohesion and Adhesion PhD webinar lecture, which is already available on our NMBU YouTube channel. So what is clarity? Well, clarity is the quality of being clear and easy to understand. And when it comes to our writing, two questions that I posed at the end of last month's webinar on cohesion and adhesion were, do I want to sound smart or do I want to be understood? Framed differently, we could ask these questions as, do I want my reader to struggle to understand me? Or do I want my reader to understand me after the first reading? And in this webinar, we're going to try to answer these questions. Clarity itself as a writing principle is not a single principle, but it's a combination of several different writing principles involving the flow of information from general to specific, as discussed in the Cohesion and Adhesion webinar, as well as the ability to maintain a character-action relationship that is clear and easy for the reader to understand. We also want to avoid interruptions, and we want to replace vague pronouns where they appear. Now, if we want to sound smart, we can ignore all of these principles of writing, but that's going to come at the cost of our writing being unclear. Now, if we want our readers to easily understand us, we want to apply these principles, and we will produce clear writing. So last month, we talked about how different pieces of writing from a paper, sections, paragraphs, all the way down to sentences should follow a flow of ideas and information. And that flow moves a reader from general information at the start, from the introduction of our paper, the introduction of sections, the start of paragraphs, and the start of sentences, and we move towards more specific information as each of these pieces of writing progresses. So let's have a look at how this principle of general to specific can be applied at a sentence and paragraph level to improve clarity. Consider this paragraph here. Calcium blockers can control muscle spasms. Sarcomeres are the small units of muscle fibers in which these drugs work. Two filaments, one thick and one thin, are in each sarcomere. The proteins actin and myosin are contained in the thin filament. When actin and myosin interact, your heart contracts. Is this difficult to understand? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with the word choices, but it has everything to do with word order. Clarity is being broken because information is not being presented in a way that leads us as readers from general known information towards new and more specific information as each sentence progresses. So let's examine this a little bit more carefully. If I were to ask you what a calcium blocker is, you probably wouldn't know. However, if I asked you if you knew what a muscle spasm was, you would probably say yes. We can say the same thing about sarcomeres. Are you familiar with this, or is this specific information? But what about things like muscle fibers or that drugs work? That information is much more general. We see this as the trend throughout this whole paragraph. So what happens if we flip the order and present the general information in each sentence first and lead towards more specific information as the sentence ends? Muscle spasms can be controlled by drugs called calcium blockers. Now we understand what calcium blockers are, making it general information that we can start the next sentence with. Calcium blockers work in the small units of muscle fiber called sarcomeres. Each sarcomere contains both a thick and a thin filament. The thin filament contains two proteins, actin and myosin. When actin and myosin interact, your heart contracts. So this flow of ideas and information from general to specific is very useful for us to improve clarity in ideas that we have already written down in a draft manuscript. Of course, we can connect this to the idea of character-action relationships. Now, we're going to need to take a moment to look at a little bit of grammar here because there are two predominant voices that we'll use in academic writing. The active voice, which will be represented on the left, and the passive voice represented on the right. When we think about the grammatical construction of active voice sentences, we can think about it like this. A character performs an action. We can take that same information and present it in the passive voice. An action is performed by a character. From a grammatical standpoint, what we have with the active voice is a subject noun followed by a verb followed by an object noun. But in the passive voice, we begin with the object noun, following it with an auxiliary verb, then a past tense verb, then a preposition, and then the subject noun. We can really look at this as how we form relationships between characters and actions in sentences, which I've highlighted in different colors to demonstrate the connection between them. And realistically, the choice between using active or passive voice comes down to what information is in focus in the sentence. If we're using the active voice, the focus is on the character. Who does what is the question that we're trying to answer. If we use the passive voice, the focus is on the outcome of an action. We're trying to answer the question, what was done by whom? So, in the active voice, we have a clear relationship between the character and the action. We have the same sort of relationship in the passive voice, but it's really more the outcome-action relationship that is clear. We have the object noun and the verb instead of the subject noun and the verb. We typically want to use the active voice when the character in the sentence is more important than the outcome, whereas the passive voice is preferable when the character is less important than the outcome or the character is even unknown. So let's look at this in a couple of sentences as an example. We're trying to answer these questions, who does what and what is done by whom. In the active voice, we can get this character-action relationship in two simple sentences like this. The research team conducted a 4-week field experiment. The preliminary results indicate a positive, significant trend. If we take that same information and present it in the passive voice, we would write it like this. A 4-week field experiment was conducted by the research team. A positive, significant trend was indicated through the preliminary results. Here, in both of these examples, we can clearly see who does what in the active voice and what was done by whom in the passive voice. And that's because we're keeping the character action or the noun-verb relationships closely connected. The noun and the verb are not separated, which allows us to maintain clarity as to who does what or what was done by whom. But let's take a look at what happens when we break apart this character action or noun-verb relationship. The problem with breaking apart the character-action relationship is that it causes unclear writing. Here, using the active voice, we have a new paragraph. The research team that was led by a principal investigator conducted a 4-week field experiment. The preliminary results from field collection of data at the site indicate a positive, significant trend. Okay, but here we have a problem. Who does what? Is the focus on the research team? Or is the focus on the principal investigator? This is where unclear writing can start to amount when we break apart the character-action relationship. Let's take the same information and compare it in the passive voice. A 4-week field experiment that was led by a principal investigator was conducted by the research team. A positive, significant trend from the data obtained through field collection was indicated through the preliminary results. What was being done by whom? If I hadn't highlighted it in both of these examples, I'm sure you would have difficulty trying to understand who does what or what was done by whom in both of these examples. So it's important that the noun-verb or character-action relationship is present and closely linked in order to create clarity for our reader. It really sits at the heart of clarity. Central to clarity is this principle of character action and knowing who does what or what is done by whom. Unfortunately, many academic writers can neglect this writing principle and lead to a lot of writing that ends up being unclear. Let's take a quick look at a real example used in last month's webinar on cohesion and adhesion from the authors cited at the bottom. We're going to begin looking just at the first sentence to try to understand how the structure of general to specific flow is going as well as the character-action relationship. Focusing just on the first sentence, we can actually see that we begin with a lot of specific information. The acceleration and peaking at 16 million hectares per year between 1990 and 2000, whereas the most general information is sandwiched between since the 1950s. We could easily revise this sentence to create a better general to specific flow that would improve clarity for our readers. But what about the character action? Who does what, or what is being done by whom in this sentence? Let's try to identify it. Here we can see that words like acceleration and has been are nouns. These are the actions being performed. And then we have two different characters. We have tropical forest loss as the subject noun, and we have source of global environmental concern as the object noun. Now, sometimes identifying these characters can be difficult because they aren't a single word, but a combination of words, and that's what we really need to try to look out for. And so now we can see that we have a sentence that does not start and follow the general to specific flow of information, nor does it keep the character-action relationship close together. And on top of that, we have one more problem. We can actually see that there is an interruption. And the problem is that interruptions disrupt information flow, making it harder for the reader to really understand who is doing what. So how do we spot these interruptions and what can we do about them? Well, first, look for information between punctuation marks within a sentence. Most commonly, interruptions occur between two commas, or two dashes, or parentheses. We also should look for misplaced transitions, words or phrases that help us to connect to the previous sentence and information that was presented earlier. Words such as since, although, however, or phrases like as previously mentioned. We then need to ask ourselves if the information is relevant or irrelevant to the sentence. If the information is relevant that is contained within the interruption, we need to move that information to a more suitable location in the sentence following the general to specific flow of ideas. So if it's a general bit of information that we're interrupting the flow of the sentence with, move it to the start of the sentence. If it's specific information that is interrupting the flow of the sentence, move it to the end. And if that information is irrelevant, we can simply eliminate it from the sentence. So let's come back and look at the original example. First, there is information between punctuation marks, in this case, two dashes. There's no misplaced transitions that are trying to connect to a previous sentence, so we can ignore this part. But the information does seem relevant to the topic, and on top of that, the information is very specific. It's a specific example that's acting as specific evidence, so it would make more sense to move this interruption closer to the end of the sentence. And what we could do to revise to eliminate this interruption and improve the general to specific flow of information is to write a sentence that looks like this. The acceleration of tropical forest loss since the 1950s has been a source of global environmental concern for decades, peaking at 16 million hectares per year between 1990 and 2000. But we still haven't dealt with the flow of information from general to specific, or to clarify the character-action relationships. So let's come back to the original, which looked like this, and let's revise it for clarity for flow of information from general to specific, clear relationship between the character-action, and removing the unnecessary interruption. Our sentence now looks like this. Since the 1950s, tropical forest loss has been a source of global concern and has accelerated, peaking at 16 million hectares per year between 1990 and 2000. Another thing that we need to worry about to improve the clarity is whether or not we are using vague characters. Well, what are vague characters? Vague characters are pronouns, words like it, their, them, those, they, etc. And the problem with pronouns is that they're a double-edged sword. Without a clear connection, pronouns can cause confusion and reduce clarity for our readers. And while we as authors often know what we mean when we use these pronouns, our readers might not necessarily understand that these pronouns are a replacement for a character or an actual noun, leading the reader to accidentally come up with the wrong connections. In this paragraph, there's actually 3 instances of pronouns being used: it, their, and their. So we should ask ourselves, in this sentence, what does it actually refer to? And we can see that there's some transition words, like the word however, which means that we're connecting to information that came previously. So does it refer to tropical forest loss that was mentioned in the previous sentence? Does it refer to the acceleration of forest loss that was mentioned in the previous sentence? Or does it refer to the 16 million hectare per year peak between 1990 and 2000? So here you can see how it could be a stand-in for any of these different characters, which would provide a clearer understanding for our reader. Now, how about in this sentence? What does there refer to? Does it refer to barriers to global forest agreements or governments? Here we have fewer nouns that there could be a placeholder for, so it leaves our reader with a better guess as to what it might be. However, it could be better to replace this vague pronoun with an actual character for the benefit of our reader having a clearer understanding of what we are writing about. And we also see there appearing in the last sentence of this paragraph as well. But what does there refer to here? A proliferation of different agreements? A complex range of environmental, social, and economic issues? Forest management and conservation? Or binding commitments? So as you can see, pronouns can make things unclear. Let me give you an extreme example that we've all probably experienced in our own life. Hey you, can you pass me that thing over there? No, not you. I meant the other person, you, and not that thing, the other thing. It's right there, beside the other thing. It doesn't matter how I tried to clarify myself here, you still don't understand who I am talking to or what I want that person to pass to me, because there is no proper, clear noun that allows for an improved understanding. The way that we can bypass this issue is keep our character in focus. We want to replace these vague pronouns with a concrete noun. This helps to keep the character present in the sentence, even if it means repeating yourself multiple times throughout a paragraph or a piece of writing. We want to start our sentences with the character, with a concrete noun, not with vague pronouns. We also want to avoid vague pronouns where there are many characters or many topics within a sentence that we are trying to write about, in which case we can go back to seeing number 1, replace these vague pronouns with a concrete noun as much as possible. So let's return to the original use of vague characters or pronouns as presented by the authors, and now I'm going to replace them with concrete nouns to improve our understanding and create clearer sentences. Now in this case, I've had to add a couple extra words, but it is for the benefit of improving clarity for our reader. Of course, there's a lot of further revisions that we can do here. As we take a look at the second sentence of this paragraph, there is an interruption right at the start. It uses the passive voice, which is acceptable. However, there is weak character action. The character and action is separated by quite a large amount of space, and there are many verbs in here that we don't necessarily know which is the one connected to the character of the sentence. In the third sentence, we have a strong active voice with a strong character-action relationship, which is highlighted in yellow, orange, and green. We also come down to the final sentence, which is also using the passive voice and is acceptable, and we can see that it also has a strong character action, as represented with green, orange, and yellow. While there is further revision that could be done to this paragraph, we can come back to the idea of seeing how this combination of moving the reader from general to specific information across the paragraph and across each sentence, while maintaining a clear character-action relationship, avoiding interruptions, and replacing vague pronouns, helps to produce a clearer understanding in the minds of our reader.